So Dr. Derk Loorbach is the director of DRIFT, a leading research institute on and for sustainability transitions. It's based at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Derk is also professor of socioeconomic transitions in the Faculty of Social Science at Erasmus University, Rotterdam. You are probably familiar with Derk as one of the founders of Transition Management, a form of governance for sustainable development. Transition management approaches have been applied in the European policy context. Derk has over 100 publications in the transition management area, and he has also been involved as a researcher in many transition processes with government, business, civil society, and science. Today, Derk will present some of the basics about transition management, discuss our roles as transition researchers, and talk about how we can use transitions management to change the world. Thanks, Derk, for joining us at NEST. The floor is now yours.
Yeah, thank you, Liliana. When I hear this kind of introduction bio, I always think two things. One is I'm old, and the second is it's all so trivial. All these publications doesn't mean anything, by the way. As a matter of fact, I just got one rejected after 2 revision rounds, and they decided to reject my paper. So that's also still happening. The first point on being old, I'm in this network for 20 years, basically from the start. So that's also partly coincidence. I came out of university and stumbled into this institute in Maastricht University, where Jan Rotmans, together with René Kemp and Frank Geels and Johan Schot, was developing the first reports on sustainability transitions, and they were looking for someone with a bit of a governance background. So that was quite coincidental. So the founder of transition management, it sounds so like something planned, but mainly it was being there at the right moment in the right time, and being able to connect different worlds of thought, but also different practices of research with each other. Emergent, that's also a way to describe it. Liliana also said it, engage with me in the chat. So during the chat, you can comment on my presentation, or you can disagree with me or ask questions. And if I'm able to, I'll include them in the presentation. The more structured Q&A will be after the break. I've also thought a lot about, okay, what am I going to talk about? Basically, I'm just going to go for the basics because that is also what was agreed upon. So transition management, it's a way of thinking to me, and it's a set of concepts and practices. And what I want to do in the next 30 minutes is explain sort of the philosophy behind it. So the way of thinking, transition management to me is a certain knowledge philosophy, but it's also a practice. And obviously you have tools to enact a practice, but it's at the heart, I think, about being a transformative researcher that wants to engage in an academic way with societal change. And we developed this transition discourse and network for this. DRIFT was already introduced. It's actually part of this emergent sustainability transitions network. When a national research program on sustainability transition started 2004, it ran until 2010, and the international sustainability transitions conferences emerged from it. There was also money to start a secretariat and fund a lot of PhDs. And that was the start of DRIFT in 2004, actually. By now, we evolved into an independent institute at the university, which mainly means they leave us alone, but we also don't get any money for free. So we developed into activist entrepreneurial academics, 40 by now, very different backgrounds, And we do academic research, activism, action research, consultancy, education, all combined around our mission to influence sustainability transitions. Obviously, and these are some pictures from the last year where we were in the media or where we were active online having transition conversations. I even appeared in a national newspaper as in a comic, because obviously the last year was quite inspiring for us. It was challenging personally, but also economically, but the whole COVID crisis obviously brought the transition conversation to a completely different level. And a lot of our internal conversations are also about how we open up our own regime, you might say, or escape our own niche. Sorry for the jokes, Liliana. And become part of the broader societal conversation that is now happening in policy institutions, in communities, in the business community about transformative change. How do we prevent being hijacked and that everything is labeled or relabeled as a transition and nothing happens? Like they are now saving the old economy, and how do we use all the knowledge and experience that we have to actually become part of the institutional changes that are now happening. And in that light, hopefully you can see my presentation. So the background, I was educated in Maastricht, very undisciplined, culture and science. So it was a mix of social sciences, beta and gamma sciences. And during the 90s, a big conversation in science that emerged was around unstructured problems, on uncertainties, and around sustainability. And the basic insight that already emerged was that a lot of the approaches that we have don't really work for these complex, wicked problems. The conversation was happening in public administration, in sociology, and so on. And with the main approaches, they referred to the typical science policy approach. So science just provides evidence about a problem or finds solutions, and then gives the evidence to policymakers and they implement it. It doesn't work that way for multiple reasons. These problems are structural and systemic, we'll come to that, but they are also highly contested. So if we talk about sustainability problems, basically we don't agree. Unstructured also means we need different types of knowledge to understand the problem. We cannot, from a disciplinary perspective or only from a science perspective, provide the evidence. We also need to talk to either local communities, people that are operating within a specific domain, living somewhere. So we need different types of knowledge. And then my background is really in social constructivism, which is the idea, it relates to the social construction of technology ideas, where people like Johan Schott come from, that solutions or technologies or social innovation in general always is part of a social process of sense making. So how we understand innovation, how we understand change, how we understand transition is a process of social construction. And these kind of insights, they lead to this idea of reflexivity, that in a societal context, there is learning going on, social learning, experimentation, and these processes more or less are driving social change. So these are sort of the academic niche areas that emerged in the 90s, pointing at a different understanding of science and the role of researchers. And to me, I was, during my university in the 90s, it was sort of the peak of neoliberal globalization. We were protesting against the G8 as a sort of, that movement a very eclectic resistance or anti-globalization movement. At the same time, Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history because the Berlin Wall fell, communism was dead, and the American model of progress was becoming dominant. But combined with these new academic niches, for me, the idea of sustainability transition represented a platform really to translate these new academic ideas into a new sort of hybrid concept of transition management as action research for sustainability transitions. So these are also drawn from how Floor Avellino, my colleague, describes what we do at Drift, because that is ultimately what evolved out of it. We start in a very normative way. So we are not objective researchers. We engage with society out there. And our starting point is that there is a fundamental problem, and we are explicit about it. And our starting point is to critically question the business as usual and the existing norm. But in our approach finding solutions, we are very much experimental and explorative. So it's about trying to figure out, because we cannot solve these major problems as individuals or as communities. And the way we do it is in an inter and transdisciplinary way. So we need to bring together different forms of science and knowing, with the overall aim really to have a positive impact on these sustainability transitions. In 2017, we tried to provide an overview of the sustainability research field, but this is just to position what we do, because in the field there are many different approaches to doing research on sustainability transitions. I myself, but also most colleagues at Drift, are more in the socio-institutional perspective and in the experimental approaches. Obviously, there's all sorts of other stuff, so that this is the disclaimer maybe. Okay, so this is the context within which it started, and the starting point in general for the whole. People can draw on it, and then I might use that later. But Matt, maybe not just yet. So the starting point for the transitions community in the Netherlands, at least, but I think that was also globally, was the assessment or the insight that we are not managing to escape from this path-dependent development, a path-dependent development of unsustainability. And we talk about sustainable development and about innovation, but if you zoom out, and these are the figures from the IPCC and the IPBES, so the climate change and biodiversity, in spite of 30 years of global agreements and all sorts of sustainable development policies, we are still on a trajectory of overshoot. And we know this since, I think, the Club of Rome, but it's still more or less the same. I like it, Matt, but please draw something cute when you want to draw. Okay. So this idea of unsustainability is the starting point, the idea of lock-in in an unsustainable system and pathway. And we see the same kind of, these were the global pictures, but this is the local level impact. And this are some pictures from a city in Rotterdam that already for decades faces serious issues, whether they relate to climate change or air quality, health inequalities, social inequalities, climate vulnerability. On all these domains, there are policies in place, but they don't really lead to structural systemic change. And you know this concept of a regime, we've talked about it before, the famous multi-level model. For us in the transition governance, we mainly use this core idea of a regime. And we define it in a slightly different way than the socio-technical perspective. So we understand it as the dominant ways of thinking, doing, and organizing in a societal domain. So the dominant culture, structures, and practices. And it's sort of partly inspired by the structuration theory, Giddens. So it's more like a social science perspective. Cultures are the way we think, our discourse, our shared worldviews, the way we understand the world or a particular domain. Structures is institutions, regulations, infrastructures, and so on. And practices are the way we operate, the way we act. Regimes is a starting point, but it's also a very ambiguous concept because it has no boundaries. And we are in a way all part of societal regimes. I'll come with an example. These are pictures more from the socio-ecological perspective, but we draw a lot of inspiration when we start to think about regime change, because obviously a transition is regime change, from complex systems theory and from ecology. So a regime there is basically the dynamic equilibrium in a complex system. So any complex system at a certain point evolves towards an optimum, a dynamic equilibrium. But this Per Olsen picture with the balls and the hills is basically the ecological narrative of tipping points, where a regime, a dynamic equilibrium that is comfortable for a long time, gets pushed out of equilibrium because of changes in the environment and because of internal variations within the system. So for us, landscape, regime, niche, they relate to this kind of idea that a regime is a dynamic equilibrium that is developing path dependently, but the context around it changes, and individuals start to deviate from the norm. So they come up with new ideas, new ways of thinking, new practices, or new technologies, for example. So this is now how we then understand or conceptualize transitions more and more. Colleagues call it the X-curve. Basically, it's the same kind of narrative that is in the multi-level perspective, but what will follow I'll show you how this makes it more productive for the kind of interventions that we want to do in transition management. Basically, what you see here is against the background of landscape changes, so external changes, two interacting dynamics are at play. One dynamic of buildup, so it's people starting in the niches, the front runners, to develop new alternatives. They challenge the norm. They invent something radically new or disruptive. And at first, while the regime is still very stable, it's very alternative and experimental. But over time, we might see acceleration. It becomes less alternative, less costly, more people embrace it. We see development of prototypes or of structures, and more people engage. And then a market or a new system or proto-regime might emerge. And this might lead to new institutions, institutional change, and a future regime. So this is the build-up pattern. The flip side of transitions is the pattern of breakdown, where a regime and actors within a regime are quite comfortable and optimizing along this same trajectory, but because of external pressures and internal crises, start to experience destabilization. Bruno Toornam talked about it more on an actor level. You can also talk about the societal destabilization in terms of delegitimization. So the dominant discourse is eroding and being challenged, or on a practice level, that people start to really feel uncomfortable with how things are going. for example, employees within Shell or something like that. And that might lead to chaos and a more disruptive dynamic that can be followed by dynamic phase out of actual practices or companies or interests. The interesting thing about transitions, obviously, is the dialectics. That the more destabilization happens, the more emergent actors are given space for emergence. And the more emergence there is, the more chaos it produces within the regime. So this might be also a moment where you do draw on this sheet. And then my question would be, where are you in this curve? So where are you actually in this transition? Because while you are drawing, and for those of you that by now know Zoom, you can find the buttons. Obviously, transitions that we are talking about right now, the sustainability transitions, aren't transitions at all. I've had this conversation with Frank Gils some years ago, and he said, yes, the sustainability transitions, they don't exist. And he was right, because they are the transitions that we want. And to be able to classify them as transitions, you need to be a future historian looking back. So what we do here with this figure is actually have people think about or reflect upon where they are in the current dynamics of change, where they want to be, and where they want to go. So transition management, in a way, is an act of social constructivism or transformative social constructivism, creating narratives of transitions or future transitions or the transitions that we want, enabling actors to orient themselves in their societal context, but also to give them a strategic perspective on where they want to go, which makes it a very interesting phenomenon, because intervening with this kind of a heuristic in a societal context in itself is influencing the context. And what we then add to it is that we also study and reflect on this context, but maybe that goes too far right now. So, I mean, you know, the hundreds of historic transition cases. I think what's very interesting is the work that Bruno Turnheim is, for example, doing, adding not only the success stories, but also the failed transitions. The interesting lesson for me is that we can understand transition dynamics in very different ways. Yes, they show the same kind of patterns I just showed in the figure, but we can also learn from past mistakes. So all the sustainability problems are basically a result of successful historical technological transitions. But also, this is, and that's I stole it from Bruno, the Jimmy Carter before the White House and his solar panels, 3 days before Ronald Reagan tore them down, also missed opportunities. So what makes it that the societal momentum in some cases leads to transformative changes, and in some cases doesn't work? So moving to the agency part, because this is still sort of discourse and background. How do we then take the step as researchers to engage with, to try to identify what is happening and to start building these transition narratives? So one side we can look at is this destabilization. And obviously we see all sorts of signs of destabilization. The question, of course, being, are they tipping points? And we talk about transition points because they are ambiguous. Yes, like in the bottom is Fukushima. The explosion there, it directly triggered a nuclear phase out in Germany. In the Netherlands, actually, it reaffirmed the intention of the then Minister of Energy to think about a new nuclear plant. The financial crisis in 2008, it was a huge fiasco, and a lot of people would have thought, well, this is the end of hyper-capitalism and all these banks doing these bad things. But instead, we used a lot of public money to save that same financial system, and they could go back to business as usual. On the other side, and that's the bottom right, is Groningen. We had earthquakes in the Netherlands, natural gas extraction, earthquakes for already 20 years, but they grew worse and worse and worse. And for years, people were building up irritation with the national government for not addressing it, just up to the point when it escalated. And it triggered a rapid phase out of natural gas extraction in the Netherlands. So what we can say, besides that these events might or might not trigger transitions, they are symptoms of this unsustainability and the buildup of tension. So they are signs that we are moving more and more towards the edge of equilibrium. And there are some papers also, Johan Schott and Frank Gils wrote this paper on different types of landscape events and crises. So some of these examples are crises within a regime. So Volkswagen scandal is typically an unsustainable fossil fuel car regime that is path dependently trying to prolong its lifetime, suppressing alternatives, fighting against the niches, even manipulating the data to suggest that they become cleaner. And then that was exposed. So that's a crisis within the regime, and that leads to direct regime destabilization. Other things like the plastic soup or the climate change concerns are typically landscape development. So they are external, and obviously they also amplify the crisis like with Volkswagen, because we're concerned about emissions and we need to move away from fossil fuels because of climate change. So it really also depends on where you draw the boundaries of your regime, what's in or not. Yeah, I'll get to the agency point, because also there you might, it really depends on what you as a researcher or observer identify as the regime. Are the climate protests, for example, a landscape development, or is that a regime you're looking at? For example, societal concerns about climate change. So the climate change discourse and the way we organize the climate change debate and the science, for example, as a regime. I've written recently a chapter on the climate change regime and how it needs to transform, and how the climate movement is helping to transform it. But when you look at the Volkswagen as a regime, then the climate movement is landscape. The interesting, and I referred to it already, that COVID is sort of an amplifier of a lot of these internal tensions and crises in a lot of societal regimes. It also leads to reinforcement, but it also accelerates vulnerabilities and attention to it. And what we also see, at least in the Netherlands, is that it comes with a lot of societal unrest. So these are some protests that happened not so long apart. In one case, a week apart: climate protest, farmer protest, Black Lives Matter movement. They are all either for or against transformative change. And our hypothesis is really that we are moving into this destabilization in food, in mobility, in healthcare, in energy systems, in education, in a lot of these different societal sectors of the economy. And it does, a lot of people feel it's not fast enough or not beneficial for them enough, and a lot of people feel it's threatening and it's creating enormous societal uncertainties. So that's the sort of the upside of my X-curve figure. At the same time, we also see a lot of movement on the other side of the X-curve figure, which is typically the S-shaped emergence that a lot of the innovation scholars would look at. Whether you talk about food system transition or mobility or energy transition. What we look at most at Drift is on sort of social and transformative innovation. Flor Avelino talked about it. It's basically the new ways of thinking and doing and organizing that emerge to challenge the regime. So this is what Flor talked about, all these networks, for example, all these initiatives, communities that are scattered across the globe that work translocally. So they have local initiatives, but they create global discourses and networks of alternative economy, alternative practices. And the interesting thing, and this is sort of not the geopolitical power dynamics, but it's a sort of more the spatial perspective maybe. One interesting mechanism that we see in this sort of upward part of the transition dynamics is the learning that takes place between people and different places and different contexts that communicate with each other through websites, handbooks, manuals, and that in a way are creating a new regime that is disconnected from the traditional structures of nation states, of technological innovation, and of a centralized control of energy and resources and knowledge. And the internet is a landscape, or digitalization, a landscape context that is helping this. So now I'm moving to the agency part. So how do we sort of then turn insight into action? This is sort of I hope I explained well that so far the way that we perceive or analyze societal change or transitions is an act of agency in itself. But also that how we look at transitions, they are not linear processes or objectively identifiable objects. What we see is a lot of individuals that interact in ways with each other, but also with, let's say, the regime or their context. So we take a very dialectic approach to agency. Flor and Julia and others call it the multi-actor perspective. You might say it's a network perspective, where individuals can be part of regime and niche at the same time. So we have lots of examples of people being a civil servant while in their neighborhood starting a citizen initiative that is being blocked by the same municipality that they are working for. Or we have people work for Shell, but they are setting up energy cooperatives within their neighborhood, for example. So how we understand agency and actors is in a very nuanced and diverse way. This is important to understand sort of the actor strategy that is behind these principles. So what we did, and these principles are quite consistent already for since I began, basically since my PhD, because they are embedded in this systemic understanding of transitions. So the most important one being this systemic character. Think in terms of this niche regime dynamics and these dialectics of build-up and breakdown and the long-term perspective. The second point is if you want to better understand the transitions that are not happening or the potential of desired transitions, let's say transitions away from unsustainability to whatever your definition of sustainability is, then you need to focus on the actors that are already engaged with this transition. So we make an effort of trying to identify who is already a part of the transition that we want to see. The third point is about this backcasting idea. So what is the transition that we want to see in terms of its direction? What are the guiding principles? And often they are the reverse of what we understand as unsustainability. So if an energy system is fossil-based and unjust, we want a renewables and just energy system. And that's cutting it short. But on the short term, we need to really focus on increasing our adaptive and learning capacity because of sort of the complexity, but also not being able to fix transitions. It's all about experimentation. And obviously there's a lot of work in the field on transition experiments, on niche experiments. The main thing that we focus on with transition experiments is this reflexivity. Is how the question, how does innovation, social or technological, relate to this unsustainable regime? Does it challenge or alter it? How does it relate to these long-term principles? Do we get more insight into the transition pathway, and so on? So these are the generic principles, and I also went through an evolution, but I think it co-evolved with what happens in society. 20 years ago, we really started with a focus on what we call transition arenas and experiments, really trying to create counter narratives and empowering niches. Gradually, as more and more social acceptance of the urgency and the need for transitions took place, and the alternatives also grew stronger, we started to develop instruments that we call Transition Management 2.0. So it's much more on connecting to the actors within the regime that are open to transformative change. It's much more about opening up niches as well, not only antagonizing the regime, but also trying to come up with new business models or more inclusive strategies. And our agenda now, and that has also been accelerated with COVID, is really on institutionalizing emergence. So now that there is really institutional space, colleagues even call it transition space, it's very hard to talk about a regime in some cases because the dominant discourse is completely delegitimized. There is a radical uncertainty about the future, and there are concrete alternatives that are just more viable and feasible. So how do we institutionalize that? Are we going to get huge wind parks operated by global business actors, or are we getting more local democratic energy cooperatives, for example? And the interesting thing is, the reason for putting the text on the bottom is our agenda has always been to very critically engage with the regime. And you need a very strong position for that. And there's a lot of literature. Bono Pell wrote a lot of beautiful papers about it, the radical core, and Adrian Smith and these people. I think if you stay true to the sustainability principles that emerge from the experimentation, it's also quite easy to take position vis-a-vis or against the incumbents, also the ones that are just hijacking the green discourse or are greenwashing. At the same time, there's also the inherent dilemma that a lot of people that want to change the system never want to become the system. So we are fighting the system, and we are all happy in our anti-system rhetorics, but this is also another way to achieve a transition, because ultimately, but maybe that's my personal bias, society needs regimes. We need mechanisms and institutions to create stability, but also predictability and community. So these are the kind of instruments that we used. Given the time, I just show them, and then you can later on look at it. I want to give one quick example before we close, and then go for the break. Yeah, so one of the yeah, good question, Göran. That paper is still somewhere in my head. So one of the flaws of being a transdisciplinary action researcher is that you are always moving forward and not taking the time to write it down, which is also quite unfortunate because a lot of the transition management literature is really old, but we're working on it. So for 2.0, we really talk about a governance mix, and there are quite some reports on it, and one paper is coming out, but it's not only a focus on these arenas and experiments, so build up the sustainable, that's really what we started with 1.0, but we engage a lot more now with also transforming the system, so engaging with civil servants, trying to translate the lessons from the niche and the experimentation into institutional change, so changing the regulations or the rules of the game. And a third one, which is the phase out, which is literally how do we anticipate the phase out of what we don't want? Coal plants, intensive animal breeding, you name it. But also that includes questions on how do we deal with the emotions that come with phase out on a personal level, if people lose their job or so on. Liliana, how much longer do I have?
Whenever you want to wrap up is good.
Yeah, can I use 5 more minutes or not?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I just want to give one quick example also of this 1.2 to 3.0 evolution. Yeah, this is from a recent publication I did for the UN. I won't go into it. Well, but it relates to Harris's comment in the chat before, that transitions are now mainstreaming. We call it the nature positive economy, but it's a UNEP publication where, in spite of a lot of neoclassical economists involved, we debunked the whole green growth narrative to talk really about deep economic transformation. So at least the narrative now becomes a mainstream. We still have to see the practice follow that, of course. So how we work in Rotterdam with mobility, years ago, we started in a 1.0 mode. So we were asked as researchers to join policymakers to work with their 5-year mobility plan. They needed to have a new mobility plan. And what we did, we have a transition dialogue on the site. So what we did, we selected individuals from the city we identified that had an interesting profile and some engagement with mobility in the broadest sense of the word. We had our own opinion that the mobility policy was too much oriented towards cars and innovation and optimization. And we organized this transition dialogue, challenging the system. What is the regime? What is our desired future? And what are the pathways? And what emerged was this social narrative. So a narrative about social mobility. Mobility is not only about cars and bikes, but it's about supporting an inclusive and just city. That in itself led to a discourse change in the policy department, but also it created the space for a lot of initiatives in the city, a lot of transition experiments with new forms of mobility. For example, biking lessons for a lot of people with immigration backgrounds that couldn't ride a bicycle, connecting it to health and to social inclusion and so on. A lot of bike cycling education. So a lot of the addressing the socio-economic inequalities in the city through mobility policy. What also happened was that the policymakers, they started to understand path dependency, because they started to see, well, there are traffic jams all the time in Rotterdam, and then people complain about it, and then they go to the politician, and the politician tells us to do something about the traffic jams. So what we then do is we come up with measures to optimize or improve the current mobility system, which in practice means creating more space for cars. And that's cutting it short, but what they said was we need to work the other way around. So we are going to focus on the problems of desired mobility, cycling, walking, shared mobility. What problems do they encounter? We're going to stimulate those modes of transport, and then help put problems they encounter onto the political agenda. So, for example, cycling lessons, helping to create traffic jams of bicycles that people then complain about, and then they are asked to expand the space for cycling. So in essence, they started to get the logic of creating a new type of path dependency from the niche. At the same time, obviously, what also happened is that there's a lot of technological innovation going on. So it created the context also to embrace a lot of the technological innovation and a lot of these new mobility modes that come into the city. But also it gave a boost to all sorts of experiments with public space, with transforming parking spaces and so on. And that evolved towards a 2.0 mode, where there's more and more evidence that the alternative is working. There's more and more pressure on the regime. There's more and more urgency also in the policy departments. And now they embrace this new mobility vision completely in their policy plans, and really coming with large infrastructural changes. So this is a figure from the local mobility climate plan that I was involved in, and they I just put in this X-curve figure, but they created this narrative basically where they embraced this vision to move to a zero emission social mobility by 2030, including a phase out strategy. We still have to see it happening, of course, but actually COVID gave it a huge boost. So let me round off, because these are just examples from other. I think I hope in this sort of a machine gun fashion, I gave a lot of information, but that it came across that for me, transition management is a way of thinking and a way of being also as an academic. And you can do it at all sorts of different levels. We were lucky enough at Drift to create our own institutional environment, because I also recognize that a lot of the academics that are in a more traditional environment, they will find it harder to work like this, to be normative, to be engaged, to be experimental, to be out there. So one of my new projects is actually to think about and to actually experiment with creating a different kind of academic environment, seeing Drift itself as a niche in the transition in academia. And I hope you all join me on this quest. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Derk. That was a